Hello. So, for today's video, I want to touch on three aspects. The first thing I'm going to talk about will be some housekeeping things in regards to the discussion board posts and moving forward with our last discussion board post. And then I'm going to talk about a few things in relationship to your upcoming reading with the contemporary period. And finally, we will talk about the final assignment. So the first thing, a couple of housekeeping things. As we're moving forward, I want to remind you to go back and review past discussion board posts. Remember, I said that I am going to be a little bit flexible with the deadlines for the discussion board post. We are coming to the second half of the semester, so we're concluding. So, it's not really necessarily this idea of meeting those exact deadlines, but making sure that you're getting something out of the things that you're reading. So, the discussion board posts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 will be open between now and the end of the semester, which is technically June 26th. So I encourage you to go back and review the past discussion board posts, particularly the things that I've been saying about your responses, because the more you review the things in the past from past discussion board posts, the easier it will be to do the final assignment. And also keep in mind that I am continuing to update discussion board posts. I'm still going back and giving comments to the modern period, and then I'm also looking at the Black Arts era too. So make sure you go back and review those posts. Again, they'll be open, they'll be available for you, and along with the updating of me with your comments, I will also be updating the grades. So between now and the end of the semester, you want to make sure that you're checking e-learning on a regular basis. The next thing, the contemporary period. So this week, you are going to read the piece of fiction that you're actually reading for this week is from Toni Morrison's short story, Recitative. Along with Morrison, what I've done is that I've abbreviated a little bit of what I usually do in the contemporary period, and I've just focused in terms of fiction, I focused on Toni Morrison's Recitative, but I also have you reading about other authors during this time. So the contemporary period is a pretty large, vague term, and it suggests what this idea of what contemporary means happening sort of right now. So when we think about this idea of the contemporary period, we're thinking about writers that are happening today, writers whose work is still being published today. So you will be reading from, like I said, Toni Morrison. You'll be reading works, you'll be reading about Octavia Butler, and you'll also be reading about a writer by the name of Casey Lyman. Along with these writers, you'll also read with a writer by the name of Derek Bell. So along with these writers, make sure that you read the description of the contemporary period. So this week, you'll see that some of the main characteristics in the contemporary period borrow from past periods. They borrow from even prior to the Harlem Renaissance. They borrow from areas, or they borrow from periods dealing with, for instance, slave narratives. So some of the main characteristics that you'll see happening with the contemporary period is that you'll see this repackaging of literary themes that have taken place in the past. So writers are dealing with questions around how do we define Black art. Writers are dealing with questions around how does art, or how does Black art and literature impact society. One of the things that are distinct in this time period you'll see is this move to the sort of the subjective experience. So when we talk about literary theory and the literary theoretical links that I gave you online, during this time period, the larger sort of literary, like sort of theoretical movement was influenced by what's called post-structuralism or postmodernism. And postmodernism and post-structuralism went from this idea of trying to understand unity and trying to understand sort of the unity within the text. They turn more towards subjective experiences. So rather than trying to understand what new historicists do, rather than trying to understand this idea of an essence of history, this sort of linear progression of stories, we sort of see this revisionist history. We sort of see history us questioning history from particular perspectives. So one of the things that we see in the contemporary period is revisionist history. So we see, for instance, Toni Morrison writing a novel like Beloved and coming back and revising sort of this idea of slavery from the perspective of a slave. We also see writers taking works from literary periods or older literary periods, like we think of a book like, or we think of a story like Gone with the Wind, and then we see writers sort of taking that and making satire out of these sort of older stories that we see that sort of have defined not just African American traditions, but just the larger American literary traditions. A couple of other characteristics that you'll see happening in this period is sort of like this attention back to speculative fiction and what's called Afrofuturism. And it's not like this thing where Afrofuturism or speculative fiction or science fiction in African American literature was new at this time, but we sort of see this attention focused on it. So whereas in the Black Arts era, there was a much more attention focused on this idea of revolution and liberation and social consciousness, in the contemporary period, we see the attention coming back or moving to this idea of dealing with liberation and dealing with consciousness, but through other means, such as science fiction and Afrofuturism, which you'll read about in the contemporary chapter. Another thing that we see happening in this time period is it's not that it was not happening before, but there's greater attention, or I should say the focus of the lens is moving more to women in literature as well. So in your chapter, in your book, they're going to talk about this resurgence and this rise of Black women's voices. And so even we see like works like from Alice Walker coming back and being influenced by Harlem Renaissance writers such as Zora Neale Hurston. We see, like I said before, Octavia Butler. We see Gail Jones. We see more of this attention. Well, before we didn't see a lot of attention placed on just Black women's experiences and sort of how that sort of reveals to us some of the larger sort of social conditions that are going on in the world, and we're going to see this more of an attention paid to this in the contemporary period that they'll talk about in your chapter. Another thing that we also see happening more largely around this period is that coming back to this idea of theory, right? This period marked by, I would say, post-60s, moving through the 2000s, was this great attention to literary theory. And so during this time period between the 60s and 2000s, we've had writers like Barbara Christian and Houston Baker and Henry Louis Gates sort of define or help try to make a definition around this idea of literary, like sort of theoretical questions. So taking questions back from the Harlem Renaissance in relationship to how do we define Black art, to this idea of the social consciousness of Black literature, to thinking about the rhetorical situation, to thinking about issues related to just the body and like the material conditions of a particular situation. These are some of the things that were theorized about in African American literary theory. And so this week, along with your readings, I've also included some examples of how writers write about or theorize about the fiction. So when you go into the content section, you'll see essays written about Octavia Butler. You'll see essays written about Toni Morrison's Recitative. So you'll get a sense of what's happening in the story, but then you'll also see how writers are writing about this story. Another influential text that I also want you to read from Toni Morrison is an essay that was published entitled Unspeakable Things Unspoken. And so I included this text because I think it's a text to think about, and I think it's indicative of this time period when we start thinking about all of like the interactions with that are happening in the African American literary context, but also what she takes up in this article is how this interaction between black culture and white culture, and like sort of even what that means, and sort of even how that sort of defines and constructs concepts of what it means to be black or what it means to be white. So these are the things that I want you to think about in terms of coming or reading about the contemporary period. Another work that I also want you to pay close attention to is Derek Bell's Space Traders. So Space Traders falls along that line of the speculative fiction, and it also was influential in sort of giving way or impacting, I should say, Afrofuturism. So Space Traders is a short story that has us reconceptualize this idea of history, this idea of slavery, this idea of race and racism. It comes back to this idea of the color complex. So even when we think about racism based off of color that is emerging within the African American culture, this story deals with that, but it has a very science fiction context to it. So along with Space Traders, the short story, I've also included the movie. So this movie, a short film, which came out back in the 90s, an actual HBO original series that was called Comic Slop, that had a short-lived series on HBO that actually adapted this short story to film. So I want you to read the short story and watch the film, and notice how when we think about African American speculative fiction, it thinks about just it challenges these ideas that we've even had in the first place around even what it means to be black, what it means to be white, what it means to live in America. And then they again come back to these sort of larger sort of science, what it means to be human. And coming back to these sort of larger, or drawing upon these larger sort of science fiction, like I said before, what's been termed as Afrofuturistic sort of elements that you'll read about in your chapter. So those are the things that I want you to think about in terms of reading the contemporary period. Now, moving on to our final assignment. The final assignment will be the discussion board post number 5. And in the discussion board post number 5, it's basically asking you to go back and think about the writers from the literary periods that we've covered. And then I also want you to think about how might these writers respond to some perhaps contemporary films that we see today. So in your final discussion board post, what I've done is that I've extended the first post deadline, so it's not due until June 23rd. And then your response to your response to one other student is due June 26th. It's basically divided into 4 questions. Your first question, you will choose one of the following authors that have been covered on e-learning, that have been covered in the readings that we've covered this semester. And then you'll give a brief description on the writer. You'll talk about the literary period to which they belong and their contribution to literature. From that point, I've included a collection of films that I think represent these literary movements that we've been covering this semester. So these films, you have the option to get them online. You can see a lot of these films. You can get them on YouTube. You can also do it the old-fashioned way, go to the video store and rent one of these films. But these films are accessible. And so I have a collection of films that represent different literary periods, and I want you to think about how these films, or which literary period or periods, might have influenced these films. And I also want you to think about how one of the writers that you're talking about in question number one, how they might respond to one of these films. And then in question three, you'll just reflect on your experience in the course. Reflect on the material that you've read. Which of the following writers, literary periods, and or stories have had the most impact? You can go on, you can expand a little bit more and think about what were some of your perceptions of African American literature before you entered this course, and what are some of your perceptions of African American literature now? Do you think African American literature is American literature? And what does that mean? What does that mean for how we understand American literature if we had this larger term, American literature, to incorporate all nationalities, all cultures, rather than separating them? And finally, in question four, as always, respond to at least one student's post. And so this will be due on the 26th. And just like the early requirements for grading, it's the same rubric for all of the other discussion board posts. This time, however, I want you to focus on including an in-text citation along with direct quotations from the reading materials. So when you provide evidence for the questions number one, number two, and number three, I want you to think about, I'm sorry, it's questions number one and number two because your question number question number three is a personal reflection. But I want you to focus on backing up your observations with evidence from the text. A lot of you have been doing a great job with that this semester. So a lot of this is going to be easy as pie. So I just want you to focus, pay close attention to that as you do the discussion board post number 5. And then again, you are welcome to do that in your personal reflection as well. So that's pretty much everything that I've wanted to cover. I think that everyone is doing a knockout job in all of the discussion board posts. I'm excited to update the discussion board posts and also hear some of your responses to my responses to your responses to each other. If you have any questions or concerns about how to do in-text citations, how to talk about literature, anything that seems unclear around the final assignment, please feel free to send me an email. Over the course of the next few days, I will be uploading a couple of helpful links to help you sort of talk about literature that we've talked about, along with those literary method links that I've given you. But other than that, if you don't have any questions or concerns, happy reading, happy writing, and I will see you in cyberspace.